I'm back this week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
They were showcasing Daggerheart at PAX Unplugged.
Yes, they showcased it twice.
In terms of whatever the core campaign that Critical Role are doing, I don't think it's ever mattered really what the system is.
Can I interest you, Shawn, in a Critical Role video game?
No.
Promised tariffs on international imports into America.
You're steeply into the political arena more than the economic arena at this point.
2024 DMG having safety tools printed on page 16.
Even if you don't need it, you also don't need Bastion rules.
It's about empathy with what somebody else has gone through. And so many people are incapable of having empathy, but they can have sympathy.
All that and more right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms. We are back this week, as we are every week. My name's Ben Byrne, by the way. If you've never listened to this before, I'm joined, as always, by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, and sitting in for James Hake this week is James Hake. James is back. You have returned to the Lorecast.
My God.
I am here, and never let me leave again. I feel my life is so empty without you.
Well, I have some bad news, James. We've got some pre-records in the can, so you are definitely leaving again over the next few weeks. But you're here with us now, and I'm going to ask you a question that was sent in by Gethin. And I suspect you'll really like this question. If you had to invent a new randomizer for a new tabletop game that's never been used before, what would it be?
We're not just talking about, using a different method of cobbling dice together. It's no dice at all. Randomly flip through a book, use the number of letters in the first word on the page.
Okay.
If I had to pick something off the very top of my head.
No, I mean, all I had was the game master picks a number between 1 and 6 or 1 and 20, and whoever got the closest, the check. If you get within 5, then it's a successful check.
I tried to come up with a list of things that haven't been used, and I couldn't think of anything. Even flipping through books, there are games that do that. Yeah. So, and then I was like, you have to move something telepathically with your mind, right? It's because even a Jenga tower isn't really a randomizer, because there is some skill involved with being able to do that. And I'm like, what haven't we used? Have we used a game of jacks? You know what I'm talking about? You drop the little rubber ball, you pick up the jacks, and you try to see how many you can get. Do you have that in Australia?
My mother was so good at jacks as a kid that she wasn't allowed to play unless she played left-handed. And she still won.
Yeah. Bowling is now our randomizer. If you get 10 pins, it's a critical hit. If you get 9, you succeed. And then you could... I don't know. So there's so many creative people out there that every randomizer I can honestly think of that's random has been used, from tarot cards to tearing pieces of paper.
To invent one you've never heard of before, ever, Dael Kingsmill.
I would love to give you the answer. And Watchful Wizard in chat is actually thinking along similar lines to me. I was thinking about what methods of randomization exist in the world that haven't been tapped into. And I landed on old school folkloric augury, right? And I was thinking about plant-based, your very simple pick up a daisy, he loves me not style randomization, right? And I think that kind of thing could be really, really fun in a very silly way, where it's just pick up a flower. Do I hit the goblin? Do I not hit the goblin? I hit the goblin, I don't hit the goblin.
Yeah, it could be fun to have a bag of bones that you throw, and you have little runes carved into the bones, and whichever ones come face up or something, then the ones that contribute to the check.
We must consult the bones.
Exactly. Maybe I just want bone-shaped dice, but is maybe what I'm describing. That's a cool idea. Shawn, you've triggered a secondary question in me. An email coming in to podcast at Ghostfire Gaming from Ben Byrne. What do you folks prefer? Tabletop RPGs, board games, war games if you play them, in terms of feeling like a system uses a randomizer for outcomes, or feeling like a system requires skill and tactical thinking for outcomes, because different games use those in different combinations to create a sense that like this is an entirely tactical game that uses no randomization, let's say like chess, versus a game that feels entirely randomized because of its heavy reliance on dice.
This was a conversation that came up a lot back when Tabletop, the show on Geek and Sundry, was sort of the big dog in geek internet spaces. And the conversation was about how do they select board games for the show? And it was because it had to be a balance between skill and chance, because you're going to get players who are super familiar with the game, who know all the ins and outs, but you want to be able to upset things with the luck of the draw and the newbie at the table being able to like suddenly come from behind and change everything. And I think I still think along those lines. I think I prefer a little, like a scooch more skill than chance, because I think people are better at making stories and emergent narratives happen than making emergent narratives happen. I think that's an oxymoron. Than randomizers are, because the randomizer doesn't know that you're telling a story. So a little bit more skill than chance, but I do love some chance.
Permit me to meander my way into this answer, because I've been playing a lot of Mario Kart with my friends lately. It's probably my most played video game right now.
Oh, do it! Talk about the Mario Kart.
And Mario Kart is famous for being a game that is technically skill-based, but is extremely luck-based in practice, because it has this catch-up mechanic, right? When you pick up items, your place in the race determines how good of an item you get. And generally, the items that you get while you're in last or close to last place are absolutely absurd in the way that they can swing the game, right? You can rocket literally from 12th place to, you could overtake first if the race is tight enough, given the, how far back you are. But I have a friend who is extremely good at Mario Kart. In fact, I have multiple friends who are extremely good at Mario Kart. I am pretty cleanly the third best Mario Kart player in that group. And it always turns out, yes, it's one of the two best, swapping 1 and 2, and pretty consistently it's me coming in 3. So our skill is fairly consistent despite the randomizer. But there are times when all the dice really did, like all sixes come up essentially, and I managed to eke out a first place victory. And it feels awesome when the circumstances align like that, even though I know, I haven't become the best player sitting on that couch. And it's a different situation for collaborative RPGs, but I still think that, a game that is even like 50% luck-based versus skill-based still winds up shaking out to feel more affected by skill than luck in the long term. You will see that over and over and over again. I don't know. I like a fairly even balance, right? Enough so that the people who clearly have a lot of system mastery get their money's worth, essentially, but enough luck to keep things interesting, to have a couple of exciting results.
I'm glad you brought up Mario Kart, because I must be the worst Mario Kart player ever, because no matter what group I'm with, no matter what anyone else's skill level is, I seem to come in last. So yes, I'm not good at it. This disappoints me. This makes me sad. And we shouldn't want people to be sad because they suck.
We should want them to be sad because we bullied them.
Exactly. Let's get the emotions behind their despair correct. And in a cooperative tabletop role-playing game, I've said it before, the delta between the most powerful and the least powerful character is the chance that your game will fall apart because someone will feel bad. Adding that sense of randomness to the storytelling element can be a prompt for even someone who is not skilled with the rules. Give them the ability to still have fun, to still feel empowered within the game, to affect the outcome of the game through their storytelling. Every game will be different in terms of the randomness versus the skill. Giving that variety will give people a game that they can latch onto. But you want to, if it's truly a cooperative game, make that difference, make that delta between most powerful and least powerful somehow able to be made up, even if, like me, they suck.
Well, speaking of luck and chance, the crew of Critical Role feel very fortunate for the luck and chance and undoubted skill that went into building the Critical Role empire now, if you will. The reason I bring that up, there's a bit of Critical Role news that came up over the last week, over the last few weeks possibly, and they did a big interview, I believe, with Variety off the top of my head, but I didn't save the article, so I don't know for sure. Winter's Crest, a holiday album, which you can now stream on any music streaming platform, which is basically a Christmas album, but it's a fantasy Christmas album about Winter's Crest, the in-world celebration from the Taldore setting, including absolute bangers like Silent Mind by Laura Bailey as her character Imogen, and Oh Mighty Nine by Liam O'Brien as Caleb. It has slight Love Actually, the famous singer character vibes to it in terms of like Love Is All Around Me swapped to Christmas Is All Around Me.
Christmas is all around.
Yeah, there you go. But hey, it's fun. It's cool. You can stream it now. Go check it out.
It's very goofy.
I think that
You'll love it more if you're a Critical Role fan.
But isn't it just perfect in terms of like, what's the next product we do? Ah, yes, because it's like, yeah, okay, we do have the singing has been a thing with that crew for a long time, and it just feels right. I'm actually amazed now that it's happening that it hasn't happened sooner, because I just think it is the perfect level of like trashy, fun, silly. Like I think that's a brilliant idea. I love
Honestly,
that.
I think this album is a great reminder to people who may think that Critical Role has gotten overly corporate over the past couple of years, that at the heart of the venture are these people just kind of being goofballs. And I'm glad they still have that spirit. It really comes through on this album. And it really came through at the PAX live show at PAX Unplugged this weekend as well.
Yeah,
where they played some of those songs live during the intermission.
Oh, did
and
they
the
really?
audience was all singing along to the 12 Days of Grogmas. It was very charming.
Because they were showcasing Daggerheart at PAX Unplugged.
Yes, they showcased it twice at the actual live show. The Christmas Daggerheart live show that Matt ran. That was a full game of Critical Role, and though it was a one shot, not using our Bell's Hells characters, but it was also demonstrated by game designer Spencer Stark at a panel the day before, showing off its campaign frames, namely the Delicious in Dungeon inspired Beast Feast campaign frame. It was a shorter one, but it was actually I'm going on a total tangent, Ben. Move me along if you like to, but this is something I was going to talk about later, is that it was really cool to see both Matthew Mercer and Spencer Stark DM or game master this game, because Matt runs Daggerheart identically to the way he runs Dungeons and Dragons. And Spencer Stark basically runs Daggerheart like he is running a Powered by the Apocalypse game. They both work. I think Daggerheart's system leans more towards PBTA story games, Blades in the Dark sort of stuff. And so I think it sings better when Spencer runs it, or at least in his style. But both are extremely functional. And I think just by comparing the two DMs, not even comparing to say who is better or anything like that, but just comparing the way that the game feels, really shows off kind of the hat trick they've been trying to pull off with this game, to draw in both players who are fans of D&D and Critical Role, and people who kind of want to play a game that's different from D&D in the broad strokes.
My question with Matt running it specifically is, does it change? Because we're assuming, I don't think they've announced anything yet, but we're assuming that they're going to use Daggerheart for whatever their next main campaign on the Critical Role channel looks like. And there's a little bit in the article or in the interview that they did, they kind of talk about, passing the torch to the future storytellers and creators. They've talked about that in the past before. I know Matt in particular has talked about one day he looks forward to being able to pass the torch to somebody else. But the tone in which those statements were being made still made it feel like that's a ways away. They're not looking at passing that torch, immediately right now. So assuming that they're going to do a new kind of core Taldore set campaign using Daggerheart instead of 5e, how do you think the viewing experience changes using a different game system, if it changes?
I'll leave this one on the table because I have no inside information on this, but I dare not speculate in case I guess it right. I'm going to keep completely mum on this.
In terms of whatever the core campaign that Critical Role are doing, I don't think it's ever mattered really what the system is. I think that it being 5e when they began, as 5e was, sort of gathering steam and climbing that mountain, I think that was very helpful as they were establishing an audience. But I think since campaign 1, it's been more about what are the characters this time around? What are the dynamics? Who's at the table sitting next to each other? Like those interpersonal and social elements, I think, are what is more important than the system. That would be my speculation. I think whatever core audience they were going to have going forward, they will have going forward. I don't think that the system itself is necessarily a massive factor. More so the sort of bookmark of a jumping on and jumping off point is more important to that.
Yeah, it's gone far beyond the game now, and it's the personalities, it's the characters. It's that whole genre even that they almost single-handedly created. This sort of live role-playing where you can watch and you can interact with other fans and you can do that sort of thing. They're there. Changing systems, they may lose a slim percentage of, if they do, lose a slim percentage of their viewers, but nothing that's going to change anything. Just like changing to a new system will not necessarily have an increase in sales for that system because it's its own thing. It's not about the game anymore.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that largely, although I wasn't so much asking about, like, do we anticipate them gaining or losing audience based on the change of system. I would speculate and maybe
about the viewer experience.
Well, yeah, because I think that, and maybe we're talking about different things here, but I'm reflecting on LA by Night, the kind of Vampire Masquerade live plays, which have a very different tone. But I think that those different tones are supported by the systems that they're playing. I think that you can't do that LA by Night style story using the 5e system necessarily, right? Because that system encourages innately super powerful characters to go out and fight monsters. And I know Critical Role, like the combat sequences are among the more boring sequences, arguably. In personal experience, I find what people talk about online is more, Vex. Vex. I had the right one, coming up from under the water, or Keyleth jumping off a cliff and turning into a fish, and those big role play moments. Are what people talk about more. What you mean, but I think the system still affects.
I think you are right to a degree, but I also think that largely the medium of live actual play content, there are very few examples where the expression of that changes drastically. The example I can think of is, I think Dimension 20 are kind of the only people who are displaying changes in system and genre in a really dramatic way, in how that actual play comes about. It is presented on your screen to the audience. Most other people are kind of going, well, this thing that Zach Eubank, this sort of actual play system that he came up with, everyone's looked at that and go, well, that was successful and good and it worked, so we'll just do that. And people continue to emulate that to a degree where I don't think there's massive differences in the way that they're displaying. I think you're right that there are some that sort of support the tone, and that comes from a combo of system and aesthetic. But I don't think that, your average Joe viewer plonked in front of the screen is necessarily noticing that difference in a big way.
I have a hunch that all of the most popular actual plays, all of them, would be as good or better if they had no game system. Critical Role, Dimension 20, even LA by Night, Adventure Zone. I think in particular, I don't think this is literally Dimension 20, but it's a Brendan Lee Mulligan outfit, Worlds Beyond Number. All of them, in their most popular shows, use, not LA by Night, but they all use 5e in one way or another. You can see, like, on a spectrum of early Critical Role to Worlds Beyond Number, early Critical Role uses 5e pretty to the hilt, and Worlds Beyond Number barely uses 5e at all. And I like it uses a D20 and has advantage, disadvantage, and they use class features. But like, if you actually look at the real meat of the system, there's hardly any of it there. And those shows are carried by the improvisational mastery, the unbelievably enormous talent of their performers. I would really love to see an actual play with that level of popularity that uses the system as a co-collaborator rather than a way of engaging the audience, a way of like falling back when they don't know what to improvise, right? I want to see a game system that is actually an asset to the program rather than being something that happens to be there by nature of the genre.
Part of what we're talking about, I'm reflecting back on what we discussed last week with Never Stop Blowing Up and how that was kind of barely a system, if I'm representing Shawn's views on it accurately, and that it was really, a suggestion, a prompt suggester for improv. That said, I think what that system, in quotation marks, provided of the blowing up of the dice, each time you roll the max thing, then you get to roll the next dice, was designed very much for a live play situation where it gets more exciting the more your dice blows up in a single ability check. But as we discussed last week, it doesn't need to be a robust system to be able to support an actual play. It just has to. It's almost the conversation we were having before about like skill versus randomization, and the randomizers within the system are really just there to change the direction of the story one way or the other, or to use the mechanics such as, Matt realizing that a fish has one hit point and Keyleth just dived off a 1,000-foot cliff to create comedy through the fact that she just went splat, instantly, and then create a dramatic moment from that.
J Pizza Beats in chat says actual plays are about playing the game to the same extent that British panel shows are about the quiz. And yeah, that's so real.
That's probably true. Yeah.
And like, before we move on, I just want to say, I don't even think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it's entertaining as all get out, right? I was in a theater in Camden, New Jersey that was packed to the gills with people who were losing their minds over a game of Daggerheart being played kind of like a game of D&D. It was like clearly the system being not tangential, but being subservient importance to the improv is beloved and is extremely fun, even for people like me who nitpick it a little bit. But I would love to see a game, an actual play that hits the limelight where you can feel the mechanical bite of the game improving in a major way the quality of the performance.
I feel like Critical Role, early Critical Role in particular, as you mentioned before, James, used to do that because I feel like I hear a lot of people get into D&D through Critical Role. What I hear less these days, and it might just be because I'm swimming more so in deeper fandom circles, but like I feel like early Critical Role did teach me how to play 5th edition D&D, at least in the basics. It taught me what an ability check was. It taught me what a DC was. It taught me what the abilities kind of were when I would hear athletics check come up and charisma check come, So I broadly knew how to play the game from watching sort of the Briarwood arc of Critical Role. I'm not sure if that's still the case. I don't watch Critical Role week to week anymore, so who knows? I feel like it's still possible for live plays to showcase a system in a way that gets you excited about the system.
It's so funny because I feel like I'm supposed to be the old guy who is like corporate, and y'all supposed to be the young folks who are like indie and it's just the opposite, right?
The idea this deep into this podcast that anyone would think that Shawn is supposed to be corporate. But go on.
Yeah. Well, but it's because I'm like, just play the game, punk, right? You do it your way. Don't worry about what Critical Role's doing. Don't worry about what Dimension 20 is doing. You take the thing and you go out and you do it your way. You go to the mosh pit. You go, crowd surfing. You go, forget these corporate people. Forget these people who are put up there with their fancy stuff. Just go out there and be you. Where are we? Who am I?
If you're not down for watching the live play anymore, if you're creating your own D&D experiences and you're kind of like, look, I'm now running my own game. I don't need to watch live plays anymore. Can I interest you, Shawn, in a Critical Role video game?
No.
Okay, fair enough.
But you can't convince me of any video game right now because I'm still about 20 games behind. So that's nothing against Critical Role.
Within the interview, I believe it was Travis was saying that Critical Role has been in active pursuit of creating their own video game. There could be an announcement coming late 2024. There's not much later than right now, especially by the time you're hearing this, or early 2025, but nothing concrete was said.
I would love to see them do with the Daggerheart rules what Larian did with the D&D rules for Baldur's Gate 3.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
Godspeed in doing that. I don't know if it's possible, but man, it would be interesting to see someone try.
Would you be excited, James? Because I assume, everything that you worked on with the Tal'Dorei setting and the Tal'Dorei Reborn and all that stuff, that's all owned by Critical Role, right? Those words, that work is all owned by Critical Role. Yeah. Because that's how writing contracts work, everybody. But would you be excited to see something that you ostensibly, created for those books pop up in one of those video games?
Oh my God. So I was playing Baldur's Gate 3. This was probably almost a year ago now. I'd gotten to the third act of the game. I was in the city of Baldur's Gate. I'd met basically every character. And when I started playing the game, I had kind of in the back of my head this idea of, wouldn't it be cool if we ran into a part of the world that I had touched in some tiny way, some part of the Forgotten Realms, right? And I'd seen nothing like that. The thought had totally flown my mind. I was enthralled in the fiction of the game at this point. And in Volo's shop, when he comes to your camp and you buy from him, he has a book that in the writing of Waterdeep Dragon Heist I named. And that is the extent of my contribution to Baldur's Gate 3. And I loved it. I screamed over Discord at anyone who would listen. Baby. It was incredible. But to have that moment expanded by, 1,000-fold if they were to adapt stuff from Tal'Dorei Reborn, oh my God, I would lose my mind. It would be incredible. I would never stop calling their office number. They'd get sick of me. They'd never work with me again.
There's something about piece of media that I love crosses over into another media. I don't mean this is a negative, but there is something about it that feels a little gimmicky. And so personally, I would love to see them lean into that a little bit. The kind of game I would love to see is maybe like a fighting game, like a classic fighter, where you just get cool art of the different characters and they all have cool different abilities based on what their thing is. And you've got cool backdrops based on all the locations that you've seen, like fight inside the tree that was in the Feywild. I would love to see a bit of that. Or alternatively, and Roman said something similar, I was thinking something a bit Banner Saga, which I know there was already a little bit of a crossover with the third Banner Saga and the Critical Role team. But I would love to see something Fire Emblem-y, as Roman said in chat, or a bit Banner Saga-y from the Critical Role. That would be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like from what they said, they're really looking for where they fit in with the video game industry. And what makes sense for them.
And the cool thing is that they are really primed for it, right? Because it's not just that they are voice actors, but it's because by virtue of having worked in video games for such a long time, they know a lot of people who work in video games and who know what they're doing. Colville and Liam met because Liam was voice directing for a video game that Colville wrote. You know what I mean? They know people in that industry and will be able to work with people they like and trust, and I think that's that is what pulls it outside of that gimmicky zone into this could be really cool.
Well, it's been a big year for Critical Role, not to labor the point so much, but Beacon launched this year, which I had forgotten about. That's their streaming service. They've diversified their streaming offerings, particularly on Beacon, outside of just the main campaign, but they have other live plays and talent kind of on their service. We have the third season of Legends of Vox Machina. We've got the next, they're greenlit for a next season of that. And I believe that they have said that the Mighty Nine animated series is coming out sometime next year, the first season of that. And which brought up a question for me, and this is, going to be speculation once more. If they wanted to pass the torch, or if they wanted to stop doing the live play, could they? Is the live play, they're almost like a multimedia company now, right? They've got board games, they've got tabletop games, they've got animated series, they've got other streaming services. They might have a video game, they've got music that they're producing. Is the tabletop live play of the main cast still their main export as a company? I know we kind of talked a little bit about like, is Legends of Vox Machina mainstream, and what does and defining mainstream on Amazon? But do we think that an episode of Legends of Vox Machina gets more or about the same or less views than a single episode of the streamed game?
I want to twist this question just a little bit, unless someone wants to answer it straight on. These shows, Vox Machina, Mighty Nine, the transmedia element of Critical Role is on something of 5, 6, maybe even 7-year time delay from the creation of its on-stream appearance. If Critical Role is indeed intending to pass the torch, then by the time Bell's Hells comes around, everyone in the Critical Role cast will be in their late 40s, early 50s. I have a hunch that if they want to kind of keep this transmedia train rolling, they will have really no choice but to have the actual play bring in young blood. And they've been grinding hard for 10 years now. The 10-year anniversary is coming up this spring, I'm pretty sure. I have no doubt that they're thinking not just of the, campaign 4, whatever that looks like, but also of whatever campaign 4 will become beyond the table in 5 to 7 years from now, once they're all caught up with Bell's Hells and Mighty Nine, etc.
We shall see what future Critical Role content holds.
Before we move on from Critical Role, I just want to make sure Dante goes to the live show and gets a headshot of Travis wearing a monkey mask with a fez.
With the promised tariffs on international imports into America that the incoming government has been discussing, several tabletop companies have expressed that there is some disconcerting notions that they might need to pass costs onto consumers, particularly folks that have backed a Kickstarter and paid for their shipping, but that Kickstarter hasn't fulfilled yet. And will they need to pay additional shipping to cover those tariffs? Because tabletop companies, all industries may be affected by this. Tabletop companies in particular are small companies that, have very razor-thin margins. And so being able to absorb these costs for the consumer may just not be financially possible for some of these companies, particularly, and I practiced saying this before, but I'm going to get it wrong here again. Cephalofair. There we go. The manufacturer who produces Gloomhaven raised concerns about the new tariffs could cause some game backers to be charged extra for shipping on crowdfunded games that they've already paid for. Polygon, in an article where they cited this, kind of echoed similar concerns. And Meredith Placo, the CEO of Steve Jackson Games, posted a whole blog with similar concerns, noting that the difficulty of incurring extra costs whilst also trying to protect staff and staff wages, whilst not forcing consumers to have to overpay for products and shipping, is going to be a delicate balancing act for some companies. So it's just, I don't know, unless any of you have anything to kind of comment on there, it's going to be a difficult balancing act, unfortunately, for some companies.
You're steeply into the political arena more than the economic arena at this point, because this is really just a political ploy to tap into the sort of unwashed masses hatred in the U.S. of anything foreign. And so we've got to down with the foreigners. We're going to make them pay, and that never happens. Fortunately, not many large businesses want this either. And large businesses run the country. So as soon as it starts to hurt the large businesses in the US, as soon as the investors start to feel the pinch, the political winds will shift. And I don't see this becoming a major issue. Of course, I can also say, what the hell do I know?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern right now is just that there is concern, right? There's uncertainty more than anything, right? I tend to agree with Shawn. I don't think this will last. I think once the reality of the situation sets in, it will be short-lived if it ever really gets off the ground at all. But it creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear. And uncertainty makes people unlikely to spend money because who knows if you'll need it in the near future. And that's, I think, what's really going to pinch companies with thin margins.
Yeah, well, we shall see as the new year rolls in. 2024 DMG having safety tools printed on page 16 discussing implementing safety tools. They sort of don't name it as such, but describe tools such as the X card, saying, have an object that you lift up or cross your arms in an X. If something comes up in game that creates discomfort for a certain player. There was some ruckus on Twitter about I can't believe they actually posted this in the DMG. How dare they? This is... We did we've done videos on the Ghostfire Gaming YouTube channel about, this is dark fantasy. This is how to play in horror themes. This is how to explore things that, aren't typically emotions, ideas that aren't typically associated with fun. And I personally think that that's important to explore, or for people to explore if they choose to do so. But within those videos, we also include disclaimers that say, make sure everybody's on board for this, right? At your table. Make sure you have these safety tools in place to ensure that everybody is on board with this. And we've gotten pushback in our comment section saying, dark fantasy is meant to make people uncomfortable. If they're not uncomfortable, you're doing it wrong, blah, 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 blah. This brings me on to William Tramp of the This Effing GM channel, who shared a personal story. I'm not going to relate the whole story here. It's their story to tell, but go check out This Effing GM. EFFIN if you want to get the whole story. But basically, William experienced a tragedy in their life that changed their perspective on certain violent actions within tabletop RPGs, because this violent action reminded them of the worst day of their life. And I thought that it was a really great story and really important to share, because it highlighted how I think even the word safety tools can be a little bit...
triggering?
Yeah, a little bit triggering. They can catch people's attention in a weird way. But even the term triggering, to say use safety tools because someone at your table might be triggered, kind of sets up an expectation of somebody kind of being the hamster and flashing back, and having an incapacitated moment. And that can happen. And I think that people should be cognizant of that. But that's not what it always looks like necessarily, right? As someone personally, I like playing in dark fantasy worlds. I think that art should make people uncomfortable in different circumstances. I have mixed feelings on content warnings and things like that personally, but I always encourage the use of safety tools, because you don't know what's going on in somebody else's world, and something that might have been fine yesterday is not fine tomorrow.
That's why something like the X card is such a useful safety tool, right? Because you can go into a dark fantasy game consenting to the idea of we're going to be uncomfortable. You can even go in without having content labels and saying, these are all the things that we're going to encounter. You can just go, hey, some stuff is going to be creepy. Some stuff's going to make you uncomfortable. Some stuff's going to be gross, whatever. But there's a difference between I consented to being uncomfortable and this one crosses a line, right? And being able to just in the middle of a game be like, oh, time out on that one. Let's fast forward through it. It's so easy and simple, and you can continue doing your, body horror wherever else without pushing into that place where it's this is too much for me. You know what I mean?
I would really love to have a conversation with someone who is vehemently opposed to safety tools in RPGs. Not because I want to change their mind, but because I really want to hear what the reasoning is. Because in all this Twitter conversation, I've been paying really close attention to it, because again, this FNGM conversation struck me really directly, right? It struck me as a prime example of why these tools are important. And all of the people who were in disagreement with that viewpoint did not, to me, present a cogent argument in any way, right? Forget cogent. There wasn't really much of an argument, just sort of rejection of the premise. And so I'd love to hear, what does that person actually think, right? In a reasonably stated, non-vitriolic way. Because to me, there's no downside, right? I wrote in the introduction to Saga of the Seasons, our Valakan Clans adventure, our dark fantasy, Norse, Viking-inspired adventure. Hey, we're not going to shy away from themes of pillaging, of death and horrible death by frostbite and fire and murder, people being taken as thralls in raids, right? Stuff that I think is vital to the dark fantasy experience, is vital to the sort of historically inspired fantasy experience, things that we would never consider acceptable today. And you have to be able to present that in a way that lets people opt in or opt out. We need to be upfront with our content here, and we don't want to water it down, right? We don't want to sanitize it, except in fairly extreme situations. But but beyond certain lines that I have myself as an author, I think we want to give power to the players into deciding what they actually want to engage with at the table.
There's a flag waving part of the United States that has this "don't tread on me" attitude. While I have a lot of friends who are in that camp, what my argument with them is, yes, you don't want to be tread on, but you are very, very happy to tread on others and allow others to be tread on without waving your flag anymore. And what it comes down to is it's about empathy. It's about empathy with what somebody else has gone through. And so many people are incapable of having empathy, but they can have sympathy. Sympathy meaning they have felt this before, or someone close to them has felt this before. That's why William's piece was so important, is because we may be anti safety tools because we don't want that power to play the way we want to be taken away from us. But as soon as we know someone who has gone through something that could be devastating to them when it's presented again, then we can say, oh, I now understand what that feels like because my friend, my brother, my cousin, or myself has gone through a similar thing. It's a big flaw that we need sympathy rather than just showing empathy. And safety tools are a way where we can, at least a little bit, maybe practice some empathy rather than needing to go all the way in with sympathy.
My wife and I recently watched Ted Lasso, which has become one of my, I know people say this all the time, but as someone who their favorite series are things like Castlevania and Arcane and these intense emotional kind of roller coaster type shows, I think Ted Lasso is 100% up there with one of my favorite shows. And it's a famous speech that he has in the first season where he talks about how, people used to underestimate him because they weren't curious. They were judgmental. And that line, be curious, not judgmental, has really stuck with me, as it's stuck with a lot of people, but particularly within this context of safety tools and supporting what Shawn was saying was it's very easy to be judgmental of someone, to be like, oh, they don't like spiders. How weak-willed of this person, or how, they're obviously not a very brave person, or they're delicate. We have to be careful of such and such as emotions because they don't like spiders or whatever. That's judgmental. And the alternative approach is well, why not? And you don't have to know to be, curious or empathetic, but just have that sort of understanding of well, there must be a reason for this, right? It's not just that maybe they've had a bad experience. Maybe they've been bitten by a spider. Maybe they just, maybe they saw a spider egg hatch and it just scarred them for the rest of their, whatever the situation is. And I'm just using this as an example. Whatever the triggering event may be, is being empathetic and understanding and being curious about it, as opposed to just making assumptions that the person has hang-ups that they need to get over. And the other thing is that safety, I triggered someone at our table by complete accident. And in the conversation that I had with them afterwards, they used an X card and kind of, we backed out of that situation. And in the conversation I had with them afterwards, I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that would be something that would be upsetting to you. And they said, neither did I, literally until it happened at the table. You could have told me that story away from the table and we could have been somewhere else and I might have been fine. But for whatever reason, in the way that it was set up at the table, that just made me feel like, no, this is too much. Looking away from the screen in a horror movie when things get to whatever analogy you want to draw, they were just like, this is it. And so that I find that can be one of the things that turns people who are previously against safety tools onto them, is learning, oh, actually, I do have a something here that I don't want to push into.
That brings up a memory for me as well, Ben. It was earlier in the fall this year. I was one of the GMs at Dungeons and Cabins, which is sort of an adult D&D summer camp that happened for its first year in the forest outside of LA. And it was kind of the final event of the weekend. I had stepped away from my regular table and I was playing Baba Yaga. And much like the dragon in the epic confrontation of Candlekeep, I was sort of swooping between the various tables and causing mischief as they tried to accomplish their various objectives. And I created a moment where in the midst of everything, I realized I had screwed up completely. I had not established necessary safety tools for the general enjoyment of that table. The mood changed in a way that I really had not wanted it to. Because when I arrived at that table, Baba Yaga cast a spell that essentially bound members of the party with a golden thread that bound them to her will. And it caused, some player versus player agency removing effects. Now, I made it very clear, all but explicitly, how to break the effect, right? It was clear, you got to attack the thread and then their mind will be freed, right? To my mind, it was a very clear temporary loss of agency. But what was going on in my mind was vastly different from the way it was experienced at the table. And most of the players were fine with it, but there was one player in particular who was immediately, visibly overwhelmed and taken out of the experience by the panic of that situation. And the incident happened. I was like, oh crap, I've really messed up this time. And I had a chat with the person afterward and apologized, and it was all good at the end of the day. But because of my carelessness, a moment that should have been cool and tactical and emotionally compelling wound up drawing a player out of the game.
Without being there and without being the context, I wouldn't beat yourself up too much about that, because I think that's one of the things is that when GMs start to talk about safety tools, some of the reticence about them is like, Shawn was saying, waving your flag. Oh, I have to change how I run my game. I can't, explore these themes I want to explore as the GM. I think that it's okay to, as long as you A, check that your players are down for that ride, and B, when the X card or whatever it is comes up, you're empathetic to go like, oh, okay, I don't need to understand, but I understand this is distressing. Let's change tack, because something as simple as like a mind control spell is common in the game. It happens all the time. Players love throwing mind control spells at enemies. I hate, this is actually almost a triggering thing for me. I hate Tash's hideous laughter, because it's so humiliating for the villain to experience that spell, right? But it's players love casting it because for that very reason, I suspect. So I don't think anybody needs, unless you are viciously trying to get under people's skin, I don't think anybody needs to beat themselves up too much, but just in the moment, being empathetic and changing direction and understanding.
I think it was an interesting point, because seeing what's been going on in the comments, the chatter in live chat has been people who have been or are anti-safety tools, either in the past or now, have been saying that there is a concern of abuse, right? Players who will try and misuse safety tools to gain some kind of advantage in the game. And like you just said, there's a concern that all of a sudden you will have to change the way you run the game. And I want to speak to that, because I think what I would have done if that had been X-carded, if I had established that in that scene beforehand and was like, hey, make sure you do something to opt out if all of a sudden this is not going well for you, if you're not having fun anymore, then probably what I would have done is like, okay, hey, does anyone else want to take the dominate effect here? Right? I wouldn't have changed my game plan necessarily. Like, is it okay, player who's having a bad time over here, if we swap the dominate effect to someone else, or do we need to rethink the situation? Right? If I could speak to the player abuse section here, the gaming the system aspect, sometimes you kind of, as a GM, have to take that on the chin the first time it happens, talk like adults, and if nothing changes, then you need to respectfully part ways, right? That's not an issue with safety tools. That's an issue with bad players. Ultimately, having adult conversations is the backbone of safety tools, right? Safety tools are an easy way to slide into having direct conversations with people who you treat as emotional equals.
So something that we haven't touched on that I think is worth talking about is that, I don't know, to have a little empathy for some of the people who are anti safety tools. I think some of that attitude comes from a place of privacy, because we talk about it, communication is king and is all important in this stuff. And there is a very real argument to be made that you should not have to divulge the darkest corners and experiences within your mind to people when you just want to sit and drink beer and roll dice and have fun, And I think that's a reason that I think there are some safety tools I genuinely do not like that are not for me and my table. I don't like deeply detailed checklists that everyone has to fill out and talk through every dot point. I think that is something that genuinely actually scares me. And maybe other tables are different and they're fine with that. But for me, I don't like putting my players through that process. That in itself can be a triggering process. And I think that's why giving any examples, any frameworks for the different ways that safety tools can look is what's valuable in this. It's not, you need to use this at your game, at your table. It's, hey, this is one, shape that this can take because it's more flexible. You can do it in the moment. You can just go, ooh, that surprised me. I don't like that. Let's move on from it a little bit. And we tend to jump to the most extreme examples as well when we think about this in theory. If you are at a table that doesn't use safety tools and you're being told to use safety tools, you're suddenly thinking of the most extreme examples as well, when it's like, I think of my most recent example of, it wasn't a literal X card, but effectively an X card situation in a game was me making a throwaway comment about worms. It wasn't even relevant to the game. And one of the players go, I hate worms. And, we laughed it off a little bit and then we moved on from the conversation and no one brought up worms again. It can be very, very low level. It doesn't have to be super high stakes every single time. And so I think there are some legitimate reactions in that negative space towards safety tools. But I think the way that is often expressed is, well, we don't need them. But actually, because of that communication and trust, that I understand you don't want to have that deep therapeutic relationship with your rolling dice and drinking beer group. I get that. But because of the kind of nuances of communication and its place within this hobby, you end up in a situation where it's more of like, even if you don't need it, you also don't need bastion rules. Like, it's just, we're just offering it to you so that it's in the back of your mind. If you do happen to suddenly need it in a game, you may not go into your campaign thinking you need bastion rules, but then someone wants to start a bastion. And where do you flip to? The bastion section, so maybe just keeping a couple options for safety tools there, accessible if you happen to need them, is not a terrible idea.
The word triggered, what does that look like at the table? And I think everybody has this idea in their mind of somebody having a hysterical moment, if I can use that word, of just kind of like panic. Maybe that's what it looks like for some people, but chances are it's not. Ideally, you don't need safety tools, but it's better to have them there than not have them and never need them. Better to have it and never need it than not have it and need it. And I think I agree with you, Dael. The one thing that I think with the X card, I don't know if it's explained in the new DMG explicitly, but I think it is important, is that when like an X card or a veil and line, like, can we, yep, cool, that happens, that character gets tortured, can we not describe it, can we just move on? When those are deployed, is that you don't need to have a discussion about why that upsets that player. You don't need to be like, oh, why is that upsetting? Why did that trigger you? Why did that, You just be like, oh, okay, cool, and move on. It's bad enough that they just had a connection to something that makes them uncomfortable, potentially the worst day of their life. Then to have them have to actually dig it up and explain it to you is not kind.
I also just want to reiterate, maybe it's a little late in the conversation to do it, but again, the origin of safety tools like this were really for groups that are made primarily of strangers, right? Games and conventions, game stores, stuff like that. They're very useful, honestly, even among groups of friends, if you want to reestablish them, what's changed since the last time I talked to you, right? It's good to have an easy way of doing it. But in Dael's example, right, the X card was deployed in a very casual, implicit manner. I think some people have issues with safety tools because of how rigid and formal they feel. I don't want to be formal and like drop rules on this with my friends. You don't have to. They're really here just to establish trust. And if trust is there, then you're golden.
Speaking of trust, you can trust us with your emails if you email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com to ask a question. I've got a quick one here to close out this episode, which is mostly for Shawn, but other folks can feel free to chip in. Coming in from Kale, who is an educator and runs a D&D club at their school, I believe, and wants to ask Shawn what literature you recommend to educators who want to teach RPG writing, particularly at the high school level.
This is really a tough question because there isn't a textbook for this. There isn't a just pick up this guide and it will show you everything you need to know. What I do for my college class is sort of a modified workshop method, which is we talk about a thing. We talk about interactive fiction. We read or take part in interactive fiction. Then we discuss it again after we read it or play it. Then the students write one based on the model that we've set out. And then we come together as a workshop and we talk about everyone's work, either individually or in small groups, similar to playtesting. And then I'll do that for each topic. We'll do interactive fiction, solo RPG games, world building, one-page RPGs, storytelling RPGs like Fiasco, and then more and more complex games until we get up to 5th edition D&D. So that's what I do. And yes, there are many great, I'm seeing in chat, what about this? What about this? Yes, I'm not teaching just adventure writing for 5th edition D&D. I'm teaching role-playing game writing. So no, there is not a textbook. And if there is a textbook out there that I missed, by all means, please let me know. But I'm talking about the breadth of all role-playing games, not just one game or one aspect of one game. That's how I do it. I would suggest doing something similar at the high school level, but really breaking it down even more. So maybe study, if your group plays just D&D, take Peril in Pinebrook, that very small RPG teaching thing that I wrote for 5th edition, and then have them write one encounter that goes beyond that based on what I've done in that adventure. That's just the quickest example I could think of off the top of my head. And then you can discuss what elements are in an encounter. Did you put that element in your encounter? Yes? Great. No? Why not? Did it need it? Are there other elements we don't need? Is there elements that would be in every encounter? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Are you familiar, Shawn? Because I'm just having flashbacks, and I wish I could remember this better because I'm about to say I found it useful. But I did a single term course or a single semester course about like designing games back when I was in university, long before I thought about it as a career. And it talked about video games and board games, not so much tabletop role-playing games specifically. But there was one book that I read bits of. I was a student, sue me. That talked about like different styles of play or different types of play. The two that I remember were like competition, which is like chess or soccer. It's a game of skill, one side versus another. Role-playing games or games of fantasy where you embody a character and you kind of explore a story. Games of chance were probably one of those. Is this ringing any bells for you in terms of like a definitive list?
Yes-ish. There are definitely game design classes, but again, that's not what I'm teaching. I'm teaching a writing class specifically about role-playing games. So we do talk about games and we do talk about randomizers and we do talk about those game mechanical things, but that's not the complete comprehensive coursework that we do.
You can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com, ask us your questions. I swear we'll get to more of them. And also leave questions on Spotify, pull over or take your hands out of the hot water first. Whatever you need to do to be able to access your phone or laptop or device of choice. And we will see you next week. I've been Ben Byrne here with Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. Babada 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 ba. Babada ba. Oh, there we go. That's how we got to end the next one.
Yep.